up to YouTube.
I'm glad. Do you want to see you?
All right. Well, this is after I finished my 6-part series. I kind of asked myself, I wanted to do something a little bit different. It's clearly a little bit different than the other stuff I've been doing. But I've had really an interest in this area, partly because I'm a neurologist by training. I'm sure you guys know that. And so a lot of times I would have to go in to the ICU and do some assessments for patients who had an anoxic injury, traumatic brain injury, and try to sort of give sort of predictions of how they're going to do, 6, 12 months out. And many times there's, you see that there's not much there, but then I ask myself, I'm not seeing much, physically we're not seeing much, but does that mean there's really nothing going on, behind the scenes, internally, spiritually? And so a lot of us who've been in this sort of field have always questioned that. Now the scientific people, very hard-nosed science people say, it's all just hallucination, it's all blah, blah, blah. But then when you start really getting into the details, which we're going to get into actually today, you begin to sort of realize that science comes up short most of the time on this stuff, significantly short. And as a neurologist, I'll tell you why I feel that we come up short. Because there's people who try to say, well, it's a brain phenomena or is it something different? So we'll present the information, and then you'll make your own judgments about what you feel. And I'll probably end the actual formal portion, probably, my hope, around 20 minutes early. So I'd like to have a conversation. If that's okay. I'd like to get you guys involved, because it turns out you'll see more people have had this experience, because of some medical issues than they actually will be willing to claim. And so you'll be surprised. So we can have a conversation on that, and we'll go from there. So this is what's called near-death experience, just a brain phenomena or something more. So as usual, this is a little bit different than my other talks, but there's nothing really medical here that you're going to do. But in general, it's all pretty much my own opinions, not Espinoza's opinions, and you know the whole drill in that. There's no medical advice, of course, in this situation. It's not going to do anything like this, I would imagine. So this is the general overview of the presentation. First, I will actually define what is a near-death experience. I will go over into how common are NDEs, near-death experiences. What are the most common elements of an NDE? And in your handout, you actually have really good information on, coming from the International Association of Near-Death Experience, or Foundation. They actually have put out very specific, almost like criteria for what an NDE actually is. It's how formal they're becoming. And there's actually the Grayson scale now. One of the books here is Dr. Grayson, who put a scale as to when he talks to patients who come through, he gives them this scale if they think they've had something, and they go over and they see how well they answer that questionnaire. Because they want to make sure that what they're talking about is more legitimate. And then we'll go through how common are they, and then what are the most common elements of an NDE, and then is there any correlation with belief in God, for example. This is not a religious talk, but belief in God in general, and or an afterlife and the presence of an NDE, which will be interesting information on that. And does the presence or quality of an NDE, or the type of an NDE people see, correlate with religious preference? We'll go into that. And does age, gender, culture, beliefs, and or life experiences have any impact on the presence and or quality of an NDE? And do people, after having experienced an NDE, become more or less or neutral, spiritual afterwards, or religious? And what is the evidence that an NDE is not strictly physiological, as in a burst of brain electrical activity, seizure, or hallucination? And then what are some of my concluding thoughts based on the current evidence that I've seen, and what are some helpful references to review? All right? And we'll do questions at the end, because I want to be able to cut off the recording, and then we can ask questions. Okay, so the first thing is to try to define it, right? And you'd be surprised how difficult it is to define what an NDE is. And I've searched different sources, and you get different definitions. And the sources I'm quoting are actually the sources that are actually here. You'll see them all here, you can peruse them. But in general, to the best that I can come up with, an NDE is really an unconscious individual manifests a highly vivid, conscious-like experience at a time when he or she is near death and extremely physically compromised. An internal awareness with a disconnection from the environment, right? So they're not talking to people, they're actually sort of having sort of a different type of experience that is separate from their physical state. So that's the definition that we'll go with. How common are NDEs? So it turns out about 4%, anyone will say 4, 5, 10%, but about 4% of the population of the Western world have experienced a near-death experience based on a random poll in the US and Germany, which translates into about, if you put the numbers, about 9 million Americans, 20 million Europeans, and 2 million people in the UK. It's probably more common than people think. And about 10 to 20% of those who experience a sudden cardiac arrest, which is probably the best model for looking at NDEs, actually experienced an NDE. So it's not that uncommon. Now we're going to go through these in detail. This is probably what a lot of the meat is, and it's in your handout. Hopefully you can see them. So there's 12 common observed elements of NDEs. From all the readings I've got, all the books and references, you can see these are the things that people will sort of describe, right? And they're coming from all walks of life now, all walks of life. So the first one that people talk about is an out-of-body experience where one is often able to predict occurrence away from where they are. So what does that mean? So in seizures, oftentimes I'll ask a patient, who has a seizure disorder, have you had an out-of-body experience? Because if you have a medial temporal lobe seizure, right, you can actually feel as though you're separating from your body a little bit as part of that manifestation. But here's the kicker. The difference is that people who have seizures do not have an ability to predict anything else going on outside of their body. So for example, you'll see a lot of cases where people were cardiac arrest in the OR, and they're being worked on, right? Obviously being worked on, and they're out. I mean, clearly they're out, no question. And all of a sudden, they are able to, not only do they come up and they can see what's happening on the OR table very clearly and vividly, they actually feel like they're floating, the energy source is floating, and they're actually going to another room, and they're actually predicting, telling people what happened in another room, distinctive from where they were, which you can't really explain that scientifically, as you can imagine, right? No seizure will do that, no hallucination, no ketamine overdose, none of that stuff will do that. I don't care what neurochemical LSD you have, those are not things that necessarily would happen in that experience. And that is very, very, very common. We see a lot of. And all of them are corroborated. That's the question. People are not put in these books, which are by physicians, they're only interviewing people that they can formally corroborate from other people that this actually happened. So that's an important point. Heightened senses, feeling more conscious than when alive and conscious, which seems a little bit odd, doesn't it? Here you are, your brain is at its lowest point. I mean, there's not much going on in the brain. It's pretty much asleep, it's out. Yet all of a sudden, you have all these heightened senses, these visual, auditory, in a way that you've never experienced before. And and they actually feel like they describe it as being more conscious than they've ever been when they were in a physical state. And that's the words that are coming out. And these are not people who are just random people. They're not like weird people. They're just normal neurosurgeons, nurses, lawyers, engineers, accountants. I mean, these are people who are pretty rigid people. They're going, this is really bizarre, So there's a little credibility there. That's one thing. The other one is intense and generally positive emotions and feelings. So feeling warmth, calm, at peace, at home, universal unconditional love, and no one felt judged. And that's important. So 95 to 99% of the people who have NDEs have this type of event, positive, unconditional. About 3 or 4%, maybe a little less, have something kind of controversial, uncertain, not as good, hard to really describe. And it often does turn positive, so there's a little bit more something going on, more turmoil going on in there. But what's interesting about these people is that all the people who have these experiences during this event feel that sort of unconditional enveloping of love. Love is the main feature of that's going on there, which of course you would think if it's a seizure, it's a rare seizure and a rare hallucination, they go, well, I want this to happen again. I mean, it's pretty uncommon. It's rare. So that's one thing. And amazingly, the majority of people who have these are upset that they've returned. Pretty universally, right? So there's like, well, That doesn't make much sense, right? If it were something more science, for the physical. I told you about the 1%ers, okay? Another one, passing into or through a tunnel. So beautiful lights, colors, moving through the tunnel at great speed. Now, some of the theories have been behind this notion is that the energy, we're sort of an energy spiritual, that the consciousness lives in our actual energy spirit, and an energy can travel to be light like a cork, right? So some people have thought that when they see this speed happening, they're like just moving so fast that there may be some truth to what's happening in their situation, that their energy force are just at this perpetual speed. We don't know, we just have no idea, but that is something that people do describe on a regular basis there. And everything that they see, colors, lights are like, for example, they will see a light that they describe is brighter than the sun, yet it does not hurt their visual experience, right? So we can't look at the sun. There's no way we could do that. Well, somehow, in this mystical way, they're actually doing that, and it's amazing. And they actually describe colors that they've never experienced before. So again, if this is all imprinted memory into the brain, which we have an imprinted map, then you only can experience things you've had experience for. Everything they're experiencing is completely different and novel to them, which would go against being a seizure hallucination. Also, encountering a mystical or brilliant light. So brilliant, all-encompassing lights, more powerful than the sun, as I tell you, presenting as a godlike practice, and again, or figure. And again, these come from people who don't necessarily have any particular belief systems. Some do, some don't. So it's just that's something that people describe. Encountering deceased relatives and friends or mystical beings. Typically, they're relatives more than friends, but they're not alive people. They're all passed away people. Now, they may have a situation where they're floating and they're seeing something going on that's in reality time because they're still able to sort of interact in that way. But in terms of what they see outside of that realm, everyone they see, they encounter, is someone who has been passed away. And we'll give you some examples of really cool, interesting, amazing cases I'll read out a little bit later. A sense of alteration in time or space. There's no past, no future, just a present. Everything happens all at once. We're timeless, right? You don't know, there's no sense of time. Everything just happened. It's like you saw, I don't know if you ever saw the movie with Matthew McConaughey. It was Interstellar. And he goes into that black hole, and everything was just happening all the same exact time. And you can just read, it's almost that sense that everything is timeless. And maybe because we're moving so fast, that there's no time. That was interesting. A life review, the classic thing you see in the movie. A lot of people have a life review, and they're seeing a very fast movie-like scene of a life review associated with all emotions, so your own personal emotions. And what's very interesting is they actually are experiencing the emotions of the other person directly as they're happening. So it's like saying that if I were talking to Nancy, for example, right? I would know how I feel, but I also know how she's feeling. It's like I'm going into her sense. And that's interesting because that life review helps them to understand the impact that they're having on other people. And they're just presenting it to them. They're not making any judgment, they're being presented with it. Interesting. Because if it was a brain thing, you think, oh, well, they would just know what they're experiencing. They wouldn't have any idea what they're experiencing. That's interesting. They're encountering other worldly/heavenly realms, seeing scenes or hearing music that are usually beautiful beyond anything that can be experienced on Earth. So they're hearing things that are amazing in sound they've never experienced before. Encountering or learning special knowledge. And this is an interesting one. This is cool to me. Learning something during the NDE that one could not have known otherwise, and to include knowing everything to the universe. In other words, they feel like they're all knowing. It's like all the secrets have been divulged in this space. Now, granted, when they return into their brain, right, when they're returning into their fixed avatar, right, they're not really able to remember what they all knew about. Of course, they don't have that, we can't. But they knew that they had an all-knowing experience there, which is interesting. Encountering a boundary or a barrier. So a barrier that prevents one from passing through, such as a bridge or a veil. Like they're going to something and all of a sudden they get a wall, they can't proceed forward. And then they're actually out to turn back. And in most cases, there's the cases where you hear they're told, quote unquote, to return, or they decide to return. I mean, obviously they all return, although you don't know what happened to people who didn't return. So obviously that. So that's interesting. And a voluntary or involuntary return to the body to be involved in the decision whether or not to return. So typically they have some sense of whether they should return, but in most cases there's an influence there that's happening. So that's part of the major common elements that you see in NDEs. So now, we've got some questions. Is there any correlation with belief in God and or an afterlife and the presence of an NDE? In this study, it did not. So like saying that it's no judging, it's just that it's there. So that the people who were atheists or non-atheists, were Muslim, Jewish, Christian, it's fine. It didn't matter that you didn't say that, oh, you're not going to have an NDE, your NDE is going to be like this or like that. It didn't matter at all in this particular group of observations. Does the presence or quality of an NDE correlate with religious preference? So for example, let's just say you have a certain religious belief. Will that influence the type of things that you might see? Turns out not really. It doesn't. It doesn't really. Does age, gender, culture, beliefs, and or life experiences have any impact on the presence and or quality of an NDE? Answer is no. So for example, you've had young children from different parts of the world who've had no experiences see something very, very similar to someone who may be a religious zealot, for example, or a biblical person. You know, it didn't really matter. So how would they know? They have no experience, so it's not determined. And whether you have any, gender, culture, anything, it doesn't seem to matter at all. So another question that's interesting is, do people after having experienced an NDE become more or less spiritual religious? These are the questions that were asked by Dr. Lang when he did his studies. Like, he's a cardiologist by training, and he had formal questionnaire, very direct. He said, I'm going to take my religious hat off, and I'm going to act as an investigator, and I'm going to ask these questions to make sure. So these are the questions that he asked. So in this case, he asked again, do people after having experienced an NDE become more or less spiritual religious? So more people who were neutral or non-believers in God prior and or in afterlife before the NDE became believers. So if you were not or neutral, you more likely became. Now, what about the others? No one who was a believer in God and or in afterlife before became a non-believer. Like, nobody said that at all. So it actually moved it in the direction of believing, which is interesting. So now, what is the evidence that an NDE is not strictly physiological? This is kind of where I put my little hat in, and we talked a little bit already. As in a brain burst of electrical activity, release, seizure, hallucination. And sort of I'm putting as my perspective, the neurologist. So an out-of-body experience where one is often able to predict occurrence away from where they are. So I said before, if it was just a seizure or anything of that, or hallucination, typically that predictability, that precognibility is not something that we see at all. So that's something very, very unique and very different that would go against the more scientific explanation. Heightened senses such that many feel more conscious than when actually alive and conscious. So again, here you have a brain that is at its lowest point of activity, where there's not much energy being produced, there's not much activity. I mean, flatline EEG after cardiac arrest is 20 seconds. So then the question is, how can they have such a heightened sense when everything is so suppressed? Yeah, there's the question there, right? Encountering or learning special knowledge during the NDE that one could not have known otherwise, to include knowing everything about the universe, infinite knowledge, and feeling very enlightened. So again, they didn't have that knowledge before. It wasn't part of the imprinted brain. So what's the deal there? There's something different happening there, something more mystical. Intense and generally positive emotions and feelings, which consist of feeling warm, calm, at peace, at home, and universal unconditional love. Like I said earlier, there's very, very few neurological conditions, seizures, epilepsy, whatever you want to call it, hallucinations, where an individual says, I want to do this all over again. Sign me up. I mean, there are some weird, like gelastic seizures where people are laughing, or even orgasmic seizures. Those can be okay, but for the most part, those are pretty much few and far between. So that's unusual as well. A life transformed after return from the NDE. In rare cases, the emergence of psychic, intuitive, and or precognibility. So for example, pretty much the majority of the people who've had an MBE will say that the way they look at life is completely different than when before. Everything is transformed. They're much less into the material things as you can imagine. Community, love, philanthropy, all those things probably matter a lot more. And it's transformed in a positive way. For some people who live with families, when they have spouses, it becomes challenging for the spouse because I've heard about some cases where people just completely give up the material aspect of life. They don't even want to work anymore. They can't make a living. So it becomes challenging to reconnect back into the world for some of these people because they see that this is so trivial in comparison to what they've seen on the other dimension. That's why it makes it challenging for those who are living here to deal with them. The very precise and clear recollection of the NDE at a time when the brain is typically at its worst, like an infection, inflammation, lack of oxygen, lack of blood flow, lack of mitochondrial energy production, and unable to encode new memory. So we know that in order to encode a new memory, we need certain parts of the brain to work. We know that. As a matter of fact, we also know that in certain conditions where there is like lack of oxygen or even herpes encephalitis in the brain, parts of the brain, the medial temporal lobe, get injured, like an Alzheimer's patient. They get injured to the point that they're repeating everything over and over, that they cannot consolidate information and put into long-term memory. So you imagine yourself, well, if someone has no oxygen, and no blood flow, and the brain is pretty much on ice essentially during that time, how is it possible that when they return, they have complete memory of what they got? There's no explanation for that. There's no explanation. So you say, well, where is memory held really in reality? It makes you question that a little bit more. The scientific evidence of the reproducible presence of a flat line EEG activity, and I've seen that, within seconds of a cardiac arrest, which is a sign of no cortical brain activity, to the best that we can tell, of course, which is often the scenario in which many NDEs occur. So a cardiac arrest patient is a perfect model, prototype, because they're pretty much immediately, they get no oxygen, no blood flow, and the brain tries to sort of stop. I mean, the brain doesn't die for 5 minutes, but it will stop working to try to preserve itself, putting itself on ice, essentially. So in that situation, how can we be processing information? Because if we're processing information, it takes energy to do that, right? So to me, based on all of these particular instances, to me it would seem as though that the science falls short for a variety of reasons we talked about. So now what am I sort of concluding? This is my opinions, and only my opinion, please, not your opinion necessarily. So I think the scientific evidence would suggest that the source of many described NDEs cannot just be explained by altered brain function. There must be something more powerful and spiritual. How that is, everyone can have their own opinion, but science cannot explain. The fact that senses can be heightened, unknowable knowledge can be learned, and actions outside of a person's awareness can be predicted accurately go against this being just a manifestation of routine residual brain activity. Since the natural brain, under normal circumstances, does not possess these capacities. Okay? The flatline EEG brain activity implies very little to no cortical brain activity, which would make all the experiences described above, especially those associated with cardiac arrest, impossible from a purely medical perspective. How can one experience all these wonderful NDEs and consolidate these into memory, as I mentioned earlier, with such little brain function? It seems like one does not need the brain to record the NDE, but one does need a functioning brain on return to recall the NDE. So for example, if someone had a cardiac arrest and their brain was like, the hippocampus was toast, they don't have the physical ability to process because now they're back in their brain. They're no longer, they're not in this, they're back into their avatar, right? So when their avatar says, okay, I need my brain to be able to process stuff in the real world, but if I don't have that part of my brain and I'm still here, then there's no way that I can process it, right? And they wouldn't remember it. So all the people who came back obviously had functioning brains. Now obviously didn't have a lot of brain damage. So they were able to then tell you what went on. Whereas someone, you don't know about the people, of course, God forbid, who had a horrible situation, because we don't know. They're not able to record. So all of the above supports the notion of the presence of a higher power. And we'll put God in quotes because everyone has a different definition of what God is to them. And an all-loving, non-judging afterlife. Our soul / spirit, energy source, whatever you want to call it, possesses a perpetual, elaborate, timeless consciousness. And our brains limit the true full expression of our spirit in order to allow us to live effectively in the physical world. Our body serves as the avatar for our spirit, and our brain, being so inhibitory in nature, mostly inner nature, supports this notion. I mean, imagine if we were all like everybody was, they claim they were in the NDE. That would not bode well for living on this earth. I mean, it would be impossible in the physical world. We have to have a lot of restrictions. Our brains have to be very restricted in our abilities. Some people who do return, and it's corroborated, who were normal people, they come back with a little bit of an ability that they had during the NDE. They have a little bit of a portal window that's still open somehow. That probably has to do with their own brain makeup, and there's some sort of infrastructure of their brain that allows them to have that ability, but they have an ability to precog. You know, they can actually predict what's happening. And you've heard about these people who had recurrent dreams, about 3 dreams, and all of a sudden things happen. You know, I had one patient actually who was, he didn't have an NDE, he was just this way. He told me that I have precognitive abilities. I go, what do you mean? Well, you know, if I dream of something 3 times, it often comes true. I'm like, okay. I turned to his wife. No. Is it kind of a little bit nutty? He goes, no, this is true. And he told me that, the classic story, that the FBI would use him. I'm going, oh, okay, the FBI is using me. And then she goes, no, the FBI uses him on a regular basis, kind of like Minority Report, you know, with Tom Cruise. They used him. He actually he couldn't predict exactly, but he was able to predict the Fort Lewis shooting. He knew that there was going to be a shooting. He said, what I dreamt was, he told me, I dreamt of a military uniform, a flag, and a rifle. And the guy in the Fort Lewis shooting was a soldier who shot someone. Yeah, it happened very soon before that. So his particular instance is that he was frustrated because he can't predict exactly, but he knows something's going to happen. Some of the people who came from NDE became that way in some way. They had more abilities than they did before. They had much more emotional intuition, more the intuitive. So again, what that means is hard to know, but they were definitely different and what they were before. And again, these are pretty normal, like us, normal people, not bizarre people. So that's interesting. So I kind of think that in my own humble, personal, whatever that means, opinion, I think I like to use the word, remember the word movie Avatar, right? I think that's kind of sort of how to best explain it, is that the brain serves as our avatar. When they disconnect from the avatar just falls to the ground. Still has a physiology. Well, I think that the brain sort of serves as our messenger vehicle system. It allows us to communicate our senses, our consciousness, to bring it forward to action. And so the brain has a capacity to take information in, to process it, to feed the soul, feed the information, so the soul can be nurtured in a sense and learn from it, because the soul gets nurtured, what the thought is. So I think that with a functioning brain, we're able to essentially, we have to ask ourselves, where is consciousness really? And in neurology, we ask that, where is that part of the brain where consciousness lives? If I stimulate this, will I get consciousness? If I stimulate that, will I get consciousness? No one knows, right? So does the brain allow consciousness to occur? In other words, if the brain is in a certain position, a certain neurochemical, sort of state, then all of a sudden there's a little portal that opens up that allows the soul and spirit to now present itself. But the soul and spirit will never present itself completely in the way that it normally would, because it's encased in a brain that is putting a chain on it. It's saying, no, you can't be like your normal self, like you normally want to be, because you are living on this earth. So I think that in my mind, I could be totally wrong, but I think it's completely like an avatar, is what it is. And when the brain gets injured, and people have a bad injury, but the soul is still in that brain, then you'll be the way you'll be that way. But it's only when the brain is separating, no longer intertwined, that the leash is gone and then the soul can actually begin to release itself. And that's what people are kind of thinking and believing who've gone through NDEs. There's something there about that. So that's I know it's kind of complicated. That's kind of what I sort of can come up with from all this. Whether none of us will know until we get there, but I think it's interesting. And I wanted to read a couple passages, a couple quotes that I got. We can touch on that.
Okay.
From